In the name of God, in this chapter, we will read about grammatical categories, typological markness, economy, and iconicity. The concept of markness was first developed in the Prague School of the Linguistic Theory. You should know that. Maybe I ask you that which school for the first time mentioned discussion about markness. That was the Prague School. The notion of markness and unmarked values of a category was first developed for phonological system by Trubetskoy, and first applied to the morphosyntactic categories and semantic by Jacobson. We should know them. Markness has since been adopted by both the generative and the typological approaches to the linguistic theory, not surprisingly in rather different ways. As a consequence, markness in generative grammar is considerably different from markness in typology. Dear students, you should know that the markness in generative grammar is different from the markness in typology. But what we mean by markness in typology? In fact, in adopting the concept of markness to cross-linguistic universals, Grunberg in 1966 introduces significant theoretical innovation to markedness. For this reason, we will use the rather cumbersome locution of typological markness in this book because it is important. It is different. The concept of markness in generative grammar or in phonology with typology. Like implicational universals, typological markness is a fundamental concept underlying much contemporary work in typology, even though it is not overtly referred to very often. Much current typological work is supported by typological markness. Also, the phenomena described as typological markness represent an important manifestation of the interplay between two major competing motivations, economy and iconicity, in linguistic expression. Okay, the phenomena described as typological markness, this is important. Typological markness represent an important manifestation of the interplay between two major competing motivations, economy and iconicity, in linguistic expression. Finally, typological markness plays a significant role in an influential model of morphological representation, that of Baibes and her associate, which in turn is closely associated with recent development in syntactic representation, particularly construction grammar. Okay, what we mean by typological markness? The essential notion behind typological markness is the fact of asymmetrical or unequal grammatical properties of otherwise equal linguistic elements. The essential notion behind typological markness is the fact of asymmetrical or unequal grammatical properties of otherwise equal linguistic elements. Inflections, word classes, and even paradigms of syntactic constructions. Typological markness is a network of apparent causal relationship among a subtype of cross-linguistic asymmetries, all of which have to do with how function is encoded into grammatical form. Here we have the definition of typological markness, which is very important. Typological markness is a network you should know this definition. Maybe I ask you about this definition and you should mention this definition in your summarization task. Typological markness is a network of apparent causal relationship among a subtype of cross-linguistic asymmetries, all of which have to do with how function is encoded into grammatical form. The general theme of asymmetry also suggests a link to asymmetrical patterns in word order and phonology, which differ from typological markness in significant ways. Okay, you should know the definition of typological markness. Typological markness is a universal property. You should know that. Typological markness is a universal property of a conceptual category, not a language particular property of a language particular grammatical category, as it is in Prague scored markness. Okay, when we say that a category such as singular is typological or marked, a hypothesis is being put forward about how the conceptual category of a singular referent is encoded in the world's languages, not the grammatical category labeled singular in English or any other particular language. Typological markness is an important tool for the typologies because it provides a means to directly link formal or structural linguistic properties across languages. In Chapter 1, it was argued that it is difficult to compare formal categories of natural languages discovered by internal structural analysis because of incommensurability, structural variation from one language to another in, for example, the category adjective or the genitive construction is simply too great. Typological markness demonstrates that certain properties of linguistic structure are basic and general enough to be directly compared across languages. You should know all of this feature of typological markness. Moreover, these formal properties display significant cross-linguistic patterns. In particular, typological markness can account for phonological, morphological, syntactic irregularities. Okay. Typological markness can account for phonological, morphological, and syntactic irregularities. One need not succumb to the temptation to regularize irregular grammatical patterns in linguistic analysis because the irregularities themselves are manifestations of typological universals. We will introduce the concept of typological markness with the category of number. Okay, we will introduce the concept of typological markness with the category of number. The simplest distinction that can be made in the category of number is between singular and plural. In many languages, such as English and Tatar, the singular form is expressed without any inflection, which we show that with zero sample, while the plural is expressed by an overt inflection. Okay, here, dear student, in this book we'll try to clear the concept of typological markness through this example. Plural and singular in different languages, which in English and Tatar, for the singular we don't have any symbol, and we show that with zero, but we show the plural with an overt inflection. Here, in this language, we have iman, which it is singular like English. We don't have any symbol which added to the word for showing the singular. And another one Butaklar and branch. Here this lar show the plural form. Not all languages are the same as English and Tatar. It means that maybe we have a language which shows the singular with an overt inflection and the expression of singular and plural. However, some languages express both singular and plural with overt inflection, such as Zulu, which use the prefixes, which here we can see them through the prefixes encoded the singular and plural. But for each of them have special prefixes. Like here, for example, in this language, in Zulu, Omo, which is a prefix which comes before the name, before the noun, which means person. It shows the singular, but Aba is the plural in this language. Here you can see that against the English and Tatar, both the plural and singular, both of them are encoded through the symbol and special symbol. Other languages such as Minor Malabry, which you can see its example in 3, make no singular and plural distinction, or to put it another way, express both the concept of singular and plural without any overt inflection. Here this word in this language show both children and child. It means that this language don't use any symbol and a special symbol for singular and plural. However, very few languages express the plural without an overt inflection and the singular with an overt inflection. This typological pattern can be described in terms of a tetrachoric table and can be formulated as the Implicational Universal in full. Here, when we have such a symbol, it means that it existed, but minus means it is not exist. Now we have a language which has no singular inflection and overt plural inflection, it exists. Overt singular inflection and overt plural inflection, it exists. We have a language with no plural and no singular inflection, but we don't have any language which has overt singular inflection but no plural inflection. It means that if a language shows a singular with a special inflection, in that language surely we have the inflection and symbol for plural. We don't have a language in this way that for the singular have overt inflection, but for plural no. This does not exist. If a language uses an overt inflection for the singular, then it also uses an overt inflection for the plural. It is another implicational universal. This cross-linguistic pattern is an instance of typological markness. Typological markness is a relationship between values of conceptual categories. It is another definition of typological markness, which is the relationship between the values of conceptual categories like singular and plural reference, or more precisely how those conceptual categories are expressed in the world's languages. For number, the singular is typologically unmarked and the plural is marked. Typologically unmarked status doesn't imply that the unmarked value is always left unexpressed and the marked value is always expressed by an overt morpheme. Calling the singular typologically unmarked is like calling the word order noun adjective dominant. It doesn't mean that the singular is always expressed without an inflection in every language, any more than all languages have noun adjective order. It simply means that the singular is expressed by no more morpheme than the plural is in any particular language. Languages such as Zulu and Minor Malabry confirm to universal in 4 just as much as English and Tatar do. it means that the example for. To say that the singular is typologically unmarked and the plural is typologically marked is to say that these categories conform to an implicational universal of cross-linguistic variation. We can infer a more general implicational statement capturing the marked and unmarked relationship in typological markness. If the marked category value is expressed by the absence of a morpheme, then so it is the unmarked value. This can also be expressed in the contrapositive form. If the unmarked category value is expressed by a non-zero morpheme, then so is the marked category value. In Chapter 3, it was stated that an implicational universal describes the relationship between two otherwise logically independent types. For example, the main word order type verb subject object exhibits a relationship to the otherwise logically independent positional word order type preposition, so that one can construct the implicational universal if verb, a language is verb, subject and object, then it is prepositional. In the number example, the two types are the singular and the plural, or more precisely the form of expression of the singular and the form of the expression of the plural. These two types are independent in that there is no logical constraint on the number of morphemes used to express the singular that is imposed by the form of expression of the plural or vice versa. Hence, these two types can be treated as the implicants and the implicatum of an implicational universal, even though they are both values in the same grammatical category like number. This immediately raises the question, however, of what combinations of two values can be related in such a way? It doesn't make sense to ask which is the typological marked value, passive or glottalized. The two values that can be related by a typological markness pattern must be paradigmatic alternatives in some sense. Singular and plural are an example of a pair of paradigmatic alternatives for the higher category of number. Paradigmatic alternative exists at higher levels of abstraction in the grammar. For example, noun, verb, and adjective are comparable members of a higher category part of speech. We will describe the paradigmatic alternative as values of a category. Hence, it is values of a category that are typologically marked or unmarked. Okay, here I know that you heard about the paradigmatic alternatives. It means that we have so many values which they can come instead of each other. Here in typology, by paradigmatic alternatives, we mean the values of a category that are typologically marked or unmarked. We should know that. If we examine more closely the distribution of attested and unattested language types, we find that typological markness involves relative asymmetries between the formal expression of values. Consider, for example, the markness relationship between the predication of a simple adjective and the predication of a comparative adjective, that is between John is tall and John is taller than Fred. One would want to say that the English data supports the markedness of the comparative degree and the unmarkedness of the simple degree. Please pay attention to this example. Through this example, you can get the point. However, the comparative degree involves the presence of not one but two non-zero morphemes over and above the simple degree, the suffix er and the particle den. This contrasts with the Yoruba construction in which only one additional morpheme, u, is involved. like here. It means that he is bigger than me. This is the translation of this sentence. One might propose that there are now three different language types: those in which the grammatical category is expressed by no morphemes, those in which it is expressed by one morpheme, and those in which it is expressed by two morphemes. Okay, here we have such alternatives. One might propose that there are three different language types for a comparative form: those in which the grammatical category is expressed by no morphemes, it is one alternative; those in which it is expressed by one morpheme; and those in which it is expressed by two morphemes. Therefore, no morpheme, one morpheme, and two morphemes. However, there is theoretically no end to the number of language types that could be described in this way. One would have to add a type for construction expressed by the three morphemes, four morphemes, and etc. A better way of classifying language types for the purpose of markedness patterns is necessary. Incidentally, this also demonstrates that the first step is, in typological analysis, defining the logically possible language types is not a mechanical process. The intuition behind typological markness is that what is relevant is whether or not the plural, the comparative degree, etc., are expressed by more morphemes than the singular, the simple degree, and etc. The relevant logically possible language types, therefore, number 3. Okay, we have such alternatives. The number of morphemes for the marked value exceed that for the unmarked value. Number 2, the number of morphemes for the marked and unmarked values are the same. The number of morphemes for the unmarked value exceed that for that marked value. I think the third one is not possible. Okay, here the type 3 is the type excluded by the typological markness relationship, as we told you in previous paragraphs. The number of morphemes for the unmarked value cannot exceed for the marked value. We told you that if a language uses a symbol for showing the singular, surely we have the symbol for mentioning the plural. But if we don't have a language that uses the symbol for singular but not for plural, that does not exist, which is the 3 part. In this formulation of typological markness, the basic resemblance to implicational universal still remains. That is, also more than one language type is possible, at least one type is not attested. As with implicational universal, this fact can be confirmed only by cross-linguistic comparison. Nothing about the expression of English singular and plural tells us that the expression of the singular and plural by the same number of morphemes is possible, but expression of the plural by fewer morphemes than the singular is not, as I told you. In fact, however, the simpler formulation in terms of an implicational relationship between the presence versus the absence of the relevant morpheme will suffice for most morphological categories, and it will only be in the case of complex syntactic construction that use of the more complex but more accurate formulation will be necessary. Another matter is which comes following the matter of markness, typological markness, is Structural coding. The preceding section illustrates some basic characteristics of typological markness, the cross-linguistic basis of typological markness in conceptual categories, and the constraint on tester language types. The cross-linguistic variation represents a relationship between the conceptual value singular and plural in the category of number and the relative number of morphemes used to express those values. Markness, like harmony and dominance in word order universals. Okay, here we have two examples of markness, harmony and dominance. In the word order universal is a much broader and deeper pattern that the one implicational universal we have used suggests. First, the same constraint applies to many more categories than that of number. The marked-unmarked relationship holding for any grammatical category, say active versus the passive, is of the same type as that holding for singular versus plural. That is to say, we are dealing with the same typological phenomenon in every grammatical category in which it is manifested. More important, markedness is a broader concept because it links together several other cross-linguistic patterns in addition to the relative number of morphemes. To say that one value is a grammatical category is marked and the other is unmarked subsumes a set of cross-linguistic patterns which should all behave in the same way. That is, every pattern is expected to select the same values as the unmarked value. These patterns are the criteria of markedness. Okay. Now, to say that one value is a grammatical category is marked and the other is unmarked, subsume a set of cross-linguistic patterns which should all behave in the same way. That is, every pattern is expected to select the same value as the unmarked value. These patterns are the criteria of markedness. Okay, you should know that the criteria of markedness, we consider this pattern as the criteria of markedness. The pattern illustrated in 1.4 above is structural coding. How the conceptual value is expressed in grammatical structure. By structural coding we mean, okay, here we have the definition of structural coding. How the conceptual value is expressed in the grammatical structure. The definition of structural coding is quite straightforward and has already been provided in the discussion of the relationship between typological markness and implicational universal. What we mean by structural coding, here we have a clear definition of structural coding. By structural coding we mean that the marked value of a grammatical category will be expressed by at least as many morphemes as is the unmarked value of that category. Okay, I want to repeat it again. What we mean by structural coding, the marked value of a grammatical category will be expressed by at least as many morphemes as is the unmarked value of the category, of that category. You should know that. This is important. Maybe I ask you in your final exam and you should know that. This definition has a structure which will recur in the definition of behavioral potential and text frequency. First, typological markness is defined as a relation between the two values, marked and unmarked. One cannot determine the markedness status of, for example, the singular in English without also examining the plural. Second, the actual linguistic phenomena which is used to identify markedness is a relative measure of quantity. The actual process of determining the markedness patterns of values of a given category involves counting morpheme of the two values and comparing how many morphemes are involved. Structural coding represents a pattern in the formal expression of category values in particular languages. Some values are zero-coded. Okay. Structural coding represents a pattern in the formal expressions of category values in particular language. Some values are zero-coded, that is, no overt morpheme expresses the value. What we mean by zero-coded, you should know that. By zero-coded, we mean that no overt morpheme expresses the value. For example, singular in English is zero-coded, and both singular and plural, in fact, all number values, are zero-coded in minor Malabry. Other values are overtly coded, that is, some overt morphemes expresses the value. Dear student, you should know the definition of zero-coded and overtly coded. By zero-coded, we mean that no overt morpheme expresses that value, like singular in English. But what we mean by overtly coded, it means some overt morpheme expresses the value. Plural in English is overtly coded, as are both singular and plural in Zulu. Zero and overt coding are properties of language particular grammatical categories, unlike typological markness, which is a phenomenon associated with the conceptual category. The important and sometimes difficult question that must be answered in finding evidence for structural coding is whether or not the morphemes being counted really are there to encode the value whose markness is at issue. For example, in comparing the simple and comparative degrees of adjectives, we counted the suffix er and the particle than, but not the couple of verb. Thus, arriving at the total number of morphemes signaling the comparative construction as 2. The decision regarding the comparative suffix should be uncontroversial, but the choices for the other 2 morphemes require some additional argument. The copula is not a signal of a comparative construction, but rather is a signal of a predicative function of the adjective. The comparative construction can occur with a modifying adjective, and in that case, the copula is of course absent, but both of other morphemes are present. A man taller than John. A taller man than John. The argument for including the particular particle than depends on the status of the additional noun phrase governed by than, which is added by the meaning of the comparative. The Yoruba example in 5, in which a verb expresses the comparative relation, shows that it is not necessary to have a particle or adposition when the additional noun phrases is introduced. Hence, I take the particle as helping to signify the comparative construction rather than or as well as introducing the additional noun phrase. It should be clear that fairly sophisticated argumentation is required to determine exactly what a morpheme signifies in many cases, and in a number of cases the answer is controversial or perhaps simply indeterminate. In addition to the problem of determining what the functions of the morphemes in a construction actually are, there are also difficulties in counting how many morphemes are involved due to processes that have obscured or eliminated morphemes boundaries. These processes are cumulation, suppletion, upload, and reduplication. Cumulation occurs when a single morpheme denotes several different values from several different categories. Dear student, you should know the definition of this process. What we mean by cumulation? By cumulation, it means that when a single morpheme denotes several different values from several different categories. For example, in Spanish, from hablo, he or she spoke. The suffix o indicates third person. For example, first person حبل mean I spoke, singular, versus plural حبلون mean they spoke. The past form and erased and the indicative. If one were, for instance, attempting to determine the markedness of past as opposed to present, how many morphemes would be counted here? The solution is to count one morpheme because one is evaluating the markedness of just one category, that of tense, and the other values associated with the morphemes in question are not relevant to that category. In the Spanish example, all of the contrasting forms involve not zero morpheme. Frequently, however, there is zero coding which involve more than one category. For example, in Galacon, there is a zero coding of third person singular animate, masculine or feminine subject. Here we can see that. The examples are not important for your final exam, and even I don't want you to mention them in your summarization, but you should now look at them for getting the point. Should this be taken as evidence for the unmarked status of third person singular animate, or all of the above? The answer is all of the above. When evaluating one category, the other categories are not relevant to the one in question. In fact, in the Galacon case, the only opportunity for absence of overt expression is when all three of categories cumulated in the morpheme have their unmarked values. This is a common phenomenon. Another process which is suppletion. What we mean by suppletion, you should know the definition of suppletion, which occurs when there is no formal relation between the two forms in a morphological paradigm. You should know the definition of this process. Okay, by suppletion, it means that when there is no formal relation between the two forms in the morphological paradigm. For example, the comparative degree of English adjective bad, worse cannot be related synchronically to the simple degree form. Hence, it cannot be treated as a combination of the simple degree form plus some additional morpheme. Both the comparative and simple forms involve one morpheme. There is a temptation to subsume this stance of suppletion under those English adjectives in which a second morpheme indicating comparison is added to the adjective, like either a suffix er or the particle more. However, this kind of one-for-one suppletion cannot be used to add to the evidence provided by regular forms, since the number of morphemes in both positive and comparative forms is the same. One for a different rule for suppletion in typological markness. What we mean by upload? In upload, as in suppletion, one cannot identify an additional morpheme, like sing and sang. Each consists of one morpheme. However, the two forms are formally related in that one is the same as the other except for some internal phonological alternation. The question that must be answered is whether or not one can say that a morpheme was added to one form to yield another form. In the case of upload, this cannot generally be asserted. Synchronically, it is impossible to say that sang involves the addition of something to sing, or that mice involve the addition of something to mouse. One cannot appeal to abstract underlying analysis here. Typological markness patterns are based on surface morphosyntax, and it would be circular to selectively utilize abstract underlying forms in markness argument only when we need or want to. This is not to exclude the possibility of non-linear phonological representation that might actually allow us to state that a linearly represented upload relationship is actually the additional of a morpheme on a different tier until we have a principled means for a nonlinear phonetic representation. However, we will be conservative and treat upload in the same way as subdivision. Another process is reduplication. Involves the addition of phonological material to the morpheme, but by copying some or all of the original morpheme in a more or less predictable manner. Reduplication shares some features with independent morpheme, namely that it represents a continuous piece of phonological material that is outside the root. For that reason, a reduplicated form may be considered to involve two morphemes, the root and the duplicand. On the other hand, the reduplicant is by no means as independent morpheme for the root, from the root, and it doesn't occur separated from the root by any other morphemes. Finally, it may be that the phenomena of reduplication ought to be given a direct external explanation in iconic term, not related to the phenomenon of markedness at all. Okay, I think it is enough until the behavioral potential. Please do it task, and sometimes there is a need to look at the video many times to get the point. The definition of terms are important. Please look at them and mention them in your summarization, and even for a final exam you should know all of them. If there was any question, you can ask me. Thank you. In the name of God.